Salkas of the Rebbe Rasha, Beis Nissen. Tov Reish Pei. Now it's Tov Shin Ayin Ches. So one of the many stories that are connected indirectly to Beis Nissen is a story with the Rebbe, which is the truth is it's a Maisa Pile Ployim. It's a Maisa Pile Ployim. And I mamish think it's true. In other words, I think it's Nita Oiz Yitrachta Maisa. That when the Bolshevik Revolution started in 1917 in November in Leningrad, which was the very top of Russia, and they made their way. There was a terrible civil war. There's no such thing as a civil war that's not terrible, but that was a particularly terrible civil war because there was like three teams. There was no battle lines. You know, you could sometimes three different groups, each one was trying to kill the other two. No? And of course they all had one common enemy, Keduma Forsum, which was the Jewish people. I heard once a story that the Rebbe Rashab was in his house, I guess, or wherever he was, or maybe it was someplace else. Bottom line, the big day Shabbos of the Rebbe Rashab were across the street. And there were snipers on both ends of the street, shooting anything that moved. On one end of the street you had one group, on the other end of the street you had another group. You understand? In the middle of a city, on one street, any person anything that moved, they shot. You know, because Mistama, you're not my friend. Al-Safik. The Rebbe Rashab needed his big day Shabbos. The Rebbe had a big day Shabbos. So it was a Yid whose name was Abzalman Idel. I don't know who this Abzalman Idel was. This Abzalman Idel lived in the Rebbe Rashab's house. I don't know if you've ever seen the video. Mendel Marozov, Elam Sholem. He went to visit the house and stuff. He remembered it from his childhood, yeah? And they say he looked around to identify, a lot of the things were changed. Walls were taken down, walls were put up, but he tried to figure out where things were. And one of the things that he identified was a closet. He says there was no room to lay down in that room. Zalman Idel was a bittel kid. He lived in the Beis Harav. Zalman Idel's claim to fame is that he printed the Siddur Tilas Hashem. The Siddur that we use now is called Tilas Hashem. So in the war years, there was no Siddurim, and he printed the Siddur Tilas Hashem. I don't know, there's more pratim to the story that I don't know, but this is what I know about the Zalman Idel. Zalman Idel, again, he's part of the history of the Beis Harav during this period, but I've never seen an expose on him. I don't know who he was, I don't know anything about him. But Zalman Idel put on the Rebbe Rashab's big day Shabbos and walked across the street. You understand, yeah? There's snipers over there and there's snipers over there. And both of them hate. He put on the Rebbe Rashab's Streimel, he put on the Rebbe Rashab's big day Shabbos and walked across the street. So I heard from a Yid who doesn't remember it, but he lived in Russia, and he heard from Elter Chassidim that when they had Tem Chatmim, at that particular point was in Rostov, where the Rebbe Rashab was. And we know about the Friedrich Rebbe, the Bali Nigle were very tired. He was very meyake, the people who sat and learned Nigle. And there was a Friday upon him, and the Bachim was sitting and learning, whatever the case was, and the Rebbe Rayatz walks into the Zal. Itzter davon alle aufhören lernen und gehen sehen wie Zalman Idel geht. Watch Zalman Idel walk across the street with the big day Shabbos, because it was suicide. It was mamish an act of suicide. And he walked across the street and he came to the Rebbe with his clothes and he was still alive. It was a nes, Pasha. So I heard this from a young man who lives near me, that he heard this as a kid from people who were there b'shas Mait. They were bacham in yeshiva. And the Rebbe Rayat said, you have to close the Gemara. And how long did it take to walk across the street? And come and watch Zalman Idel cross the street. We had snipers on both ends, you understand? And the Rebbe Rashab needed his big day Shabbos. But there's a little detail that's negeh to us. We're talking about bad weather. I was thinking about it this morning. That when they came into Rostov, the Rebbe, I'm going to talk about business in the second hour. That's my plan. The Rebbe Rashab came into Rostov. When the communists came into the Rostov, the Rebbe Rashab said, Ich ken mit zein nit seinen einen. I can't live with them. I cannot cohabit with them. And it's very obvious that the Rebbe Rashab made the decision to pass away early. The Friedrich Rebbe said that Beis Nisne gewen lalei ite. The Rebbe Rashab passed away a number of years before his time. He made the conscious decision to pass away before his time. And he left it for the Friedrich Rebbe. The exact same story happened by the Mittler Rebbe, and the Rebbe Rashab was the Mittler Rebbe's namesake. When it came to the Cantonists, where he said, Ich ken das nit, I can't do this, And over there is a Pashat HaHemshech HaSipur that he went to the Alter Rebbe in Hadich, and he came out, the Tatot Merab Gizak from the Rabbonis. My father freed me from the Rabbonis. So at the time they thought he was going to move to Eretz Yisrael, so Keinem mit eingefallen, the Rebbe Marash was, the middle Rebbe was 53, 54. He passed away on his 54th birthday. He was a young man. The Tatat Merab Gizak from the Rabbonis. My father freed me from the Rabbonis. But anyway, so he said, Ich kem mit seinen Einen. The Rebbe Rashab said, I cannot live with him. And then there's another comment, which is a Teire Shebal Peh, and I think it comes from Yankel Landau. Said, Amol kumen a junger man mit zerissene Schiche v'tziarob varf. Sometime in the future, a young man with torn shoes will come, v'tziarob varf. And this is where Yiddish and English fail. In Yiddish, v'tziarob varf means, and he will throw them off, could mean either his shoes or the communists. And the Kavanah was both. So we grew up with the Rebbe's torn shoes. I don't know if you remember this. The Rebbe walked around with torn shoes for 17 years. They wouldn't change his shoes. And I heard from Chai Baruch Alberstam that he told the Rebbetzin, and the Rebbetzin took care of the Rebbe. When the Rebbe got a new kapota, the Rebbetzin came to 770 to talk to the tailor that is always cooking his daf design. When the Rebbe got a new hat, the Rebbetzin took care of the Rebbe Bagashmias. She made sure that he looked good. Bepashtas. In Das Tachten. The Rebbe looked after the Rebbe, and if the Rebbe didn't get new shoes, it wasn't the Rebbe didn't notice. The Rebbe didn't get new shoes, and the Rebbe understood that some things you don't bestellt sich nicht of them. So Chaim Baruch comes to the house, and he tells the Rebbe, and Chaim Baruch was very close, that the Rebbe's shoes are torn to shreds. This was in the 70s, and he wore them another 12 years, 15 years after that. So the Rebbe says to him, the next time the Rebbe goes to the ale, take him to the shoemaker, and get him to take a very soft piece of leather, and put it in on the inside of the shoe. So Chaim Baruch comes to 770. When the Rebbe used to go to the Oyel, in those days it was more or less twice a month, they would clean the Rebbe's room. Now, cleaning the Rebbe's room doesn't mean touching things. It pushed meant sweeping the floor and things like that. They cleaned it as much as they could. They didn't touch. If the Rebbe put a piece of paper in a certain spot, it stayed in that spot. But they would clean as much as they could clean the Rebbe's cheder. So he went into the Rebbe's room to clean. And he took the shoes. So labels are saying gesund to stark. Says where you going with the shoes? He said, well, I told the Rebbetzin the condition of the shoes, and the Rebbetzin suggested kach v'kach. So Label says to, I heard of Chaim Baruch myself. Label says to Chaim Baruch, listen, I'm not going to mix in with the Rebbetzin, but you should know you're playing with fire. Because every time he comes from the ale, the first question he asks, the Zel B'shich, every time he came from the ale, you didn't change my shoes. So I was thinking this morning, as I was walking in the cold weather and thinking, I don't mind when it's cold, but I mind when it's cold when I expect it to be warm. And I imagine the Rebbe walking with those shoes in the snow. The Rebbe used to walk home, in the Lamed, the Rebbe walked home till Tavshin Mem Aleph. In the snow and in the rain, the Rebbe was wearing shoes, there was nothing left. So going to give from the Sheikh, you know that the Rebbe's left shoe was pressed down. The back of the shoe it was like a slipper. The Rebbe was walking around. There was nothing on his feet. Nothing on his feet. I don't think the Rebbe ever was rubbers or boots. Boots for sure not. And the Rebbe walked with those shoes in cold and the rain. But the Rebbe walked around with these torn shoes for 17 years, and then he put on new shoes. And then the communists fell. It's a story which we witnessed with our eyes. You have to read about it in the book, a fable. We witnessed this with our fleishikoim. Anyway, so I thought of this because of the weather and Beis Nissen and the Rebbe's shoes, so that's what you got. Okay, so Mr. in the next hour, I want to do a little both, but now I want to do Tanya. Okay, I want to do Tanya. Now, if you've been here every Sunday, you know that the last 2 weeks we've done Baal Peh, all oral, no text. Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes. And then we did Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod. So last week I gave you a class at Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod. I went home, I sat in my room, I edited the class. And I sort of felt like, and I told it to you last week, that I was being equivocal. I was being circumspect. I was beating around the bush. I didn't want to say straight what I was thinking. And the reason I didn't want to say straight what I was thinking, because I wasn't comfortable saying it straight. I wasn't comfortable saying it straight because you have to have a mokir. You have to have a source in Chassidus. And Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod, like I told you, on the one hand there's a lot on it, on the other hand there's very little on it. And there's a lot of contradiction. It's very difficult to have an absolute clarity about how you understand the mid of Netzach and the mid of Hoid, the mid of Yesod. But I'm going to start today's class by reviewing last week's class, and today I'm going to say it unequivocally. Direct. I'll say what I think. I just hope what I think is not wrong, but I don't know if what I think is not wrong. You don't like it can't. How could it be right? But okay, I'm going to say nevertheless. Okay, the first thing you have to understand is that Netzach Chayd and Yossi are not emotions. The way Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes are emotions. Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes are emotions, which is a person feeling how he feels about something. Something happens. How do you feel about it? Something happens to you, something happens to your husband, something happens to your children, something happens to your father, to your mother, to your sister, to your brother, to your community. Something happens, and you react emotionally. Something happens, and you react emotionally to the happening. Or in a little Eidel, you get information, you find out knowledge, data, yeda. Yesterday you didn't know it, today you know it, and you respond emotionally to the information that you have. Yeah, Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Summit. Yesterday I heard a word, I'm going to chazir it. I heard a word in my shir. I gave yesterday a shir to the men, to the men and the women. It's the men and the women with a good mechitza. We do the Shabbos morning, look at the Torah. So the guy who comes to my classes, very interesting Jew, every once in a while I'll come out with a word. I don't know where this guy, he has almost like a Ruach HaKodesh. It's interesting how things come out of him. But so he told me yesterday in Shir, it's a certain context, and even though I'm not giving you the whole background, I don't want you to misunderstand it. It doesn't matter what we're talking about, but he said to me that he heard that the Rebbe said once that you're not allowed to say a good goy. Not allowed to say a good goy. It's actually, it brought the Shulchan Aruch. When you see a goy, you have to say Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Sabbat. When you look at a goy, not just saying a good goy, but you see the Eibishter. This was the word. You're not allowed to say a good goy, so you shouldn't say a bad goy. You should say Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Sabbat. There's a lot of haskalah to this. There's a lot of mysticism to this. The mysticism to this basically goes as follows: that la'asad lovei, Yid not gonna have tchias hameis. Yeah, goyim who kept Sheva mitzvahs b'nei neach, who are chsidim masayilom, will also have tchias hameis. Animals and goyim who didn't keep Sheva mitzvahs b'nei neach, animals with which a mitzvah was not performed, and goyim who did not keep Sheva mitzvahs b'nei neach, what's going to happen to them? They're not going to disappear. Nothing can disappear. Why can't anything disappear? Because everything is the Eibishter. But they're going to become the Eibishter again. Before the Eibishter made them, they were a part of the Eibishter. And Tchias HaMeisim, if you serve the Eibishter, if you were a Lakus, so your Metzias becomes the Lakus of Tchias HaMeisim. If you didn't serve the Eibishter, you go back to what you really are, the Eibishter. So you see a Yid or a Goy who keeps Shav Mitzvah Nenech, La'asad Lavi, he's going to be what he is now. If he doesn't keep Shav Mitzvah, La'asad Lavi is going to be the Eibishter. So you look at a Goy, so say, I'm looking at the Eibishter, Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Summit. It's a tifa word. He said that, the Rebbe said it. I said to him, I need a source. I have no, the Chazah fired the kavod. And a guy tells it to me, and he's not the biggest mosque in the universe. He's not a guy who's Fashet HaSach Chassidus. He's a pure neshama. He's a simple Jew, but he comes up with these lines that are like, whoa. I said to him, what's your source? He doesn't know. He knows the Rebbe said. You can't make this up. It's a very deep dead head. But this is what Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes are. You something happens, you get information, and you react. That's Chagas. What's Nihi? Netzach Chayd and Yossi. They're not reactionary emotions. They're not hispoilus. They're not something happens and I react. To the contrary, I need to get something done in the world. And I have challenges. The world is itself a challenge. To push it through from the theoretical state to the actual state requires a lot of things, a lot of planning, a lot of deliberateness, a lot of patience, a lot of skill, and a lot of determination. And the mides, the emotions that project, that give a koyach to see something through from the potential to the actual, are called netzach hed and yesed. In other words, it's not 6 emotions, it's 2 sets of 3 that are very far apart. Chagas is how you feel about what's going on. Nihi is the emotions needed in doing something in the world. They're very, very, very separate. In Kabbalah it's written that Netzach, Hed, and Yosei are lebarmi gufa. They're outside of the guf. They're not about you. They're about the world outside of you. So what's the difference between Netzach and Hoyd and Yosei? So first I want to generalize. Netzach and Hoid are emotions that you draw from within yourself to fight with the world. That means you need to do something. You need to do something. And the world doesn't let you. Now the world doesn't have to try very hard to not let you. The world has to just exist. Yeah, you want to run across the street. So there's air that you have to run through that slows you down. That's how it works. Yeah, you're in a swimming pool. You want to walk from one side of the swimming pool to the other side of the swimming pool. The water holds you back. You have to push through the water. So you realize that you're being held back. When you're walking through air, you don't realize that the air is holding you back because you've never experienced an environment where there is no air. But Elam Haza is resistant. That's its basic nature. And if you want to get anything done in this world, you have to push it through. Especially if you want to bring something into this world, what just do with Kedushin, Elokus, and Ruchnius, that you're fighting. Elam Haza is your enemy. Seinacha. So you have to push it through. So Netzach and Hoid are emotions that give you strength. That's what they are. Yeah, you see the world. That's how you have to understand it. Netzach and Hoid sees the world as an enemy, and they're fighting with the world. I'm not interested in fighting with an enemy. I'm interested in getting something done. Yeah, between here and here, there's this. I have to break it. That's all. You want to get something done. You want to get something done, and the world stands in your way. So you draw strength from in you to fight with the world. So even though your interest is not fighting with the world, your interest is changing the world, your interest is bringing something into the world that by itself does not exist, the emotions involved in bringing it into the world are an aggressiveness. Netzach is aggression. Netzach is determination. I translate Netzach as determination, and I translate Hoid as stubbornness. Those are my translations. I think they're the most inclusive. There's so many different. Literally, Netzach means victory. Yeah, you could translate Hoid as submission. Some people mistranslate Hoid as beauty. Hoid means like Meida'ani, submission, acceptance. So I translate it as stubbornness. Netzach is aggressive. I see an enemy, I fight with him. Hoid doesn't fight with anybody, but he's an action. You can't move him. He just stands his ground. But both Netzach and Hoid share the characteristic that you are using emotion not only to get what you need done, but to fight with the enemy who stands in your way. In other words, your enemy is, you're acknowledging that there's an opponent. You acknowledge that there's an enemy. And the enemy is not letting you do what you need to do. Right? What do we call that enemy, Bechlal? And what do we call that enemy on Beis Nissen Befrat? We call him Reishis Goyim Amalek. Right? We all know the story that the last Maimer, or the second to the last Maimer, that Rebbe Rashab said, Purim by Fabreng. When the Bolsheviks, when the communists came in and he was Mavatal them Ka'afra Da'ara. He said the Maimer Reishis Goyim Amalek. And then Shabbos Pashas Tzav, which is next Shabbos, Shabbos HaGodol. The Friedrich Rebbe was the end of Shiva, the last day of Shiva. Yeah, the Levi was on Sunday, the last day of Shiva was Shabbos. So Sunday afternoon, the Friedrich Rebbe called in Berel Rifkin, who was a bocher. And he said to Berel Rifkin that my father wrote to me in my tzavah that I have to say Chassidus. But I don't feel worthy, I don't feel justified, I don't feel righteous enough to say Chassidus. So I'm going to say Chassidus to you and that'll be it. And the Friedrich Rebbe, and he shouldn't tell anybody. So Berel Rifkin told the Friedrich Rebbe that he's not promising not to tell anybody. He's not committing himself. So the Rebbe Rayatz upon him, the cabinetic, his office was a very large room. And the two of them walked together, paced side by side, the Friedrich Rebbe and Berel Rifkin, paced back and forth, and the Friedrich Rebbe said the Maimer Reishis Goyim Amalek of his father, word for word. He repeated the Reishis Goyim Amalek from his father, from Purim, os ba'os, word for word. And after saying a few lines, he would stop, and he would say Hezbid, explain it, and then he would say again, word for word. The Rav Eilid, the door was open a little bit, and the Shmuel Gerari walked by. Shmuel Gerari was a very famous chassid, and he poked, and Berel Rifkin motioned, as al Arain. You should walk in. He wanted that more than one person should see this. The last day of Shiva, you understand? And the Shmuel Gerari walked into the Cheder, and the Friedrich Rebbe looked up and saw him, and did not ask him to leave, and this was the end of the resistance. But the Friedrich Rebbe, there was zero. The Nesias was Saribi gegangen, there was no stop and start. It just went naturally over. From the Rebbe Rashab to the Friedrich Rebbe. Anyway, there's a klipa called Amalek, and he's your enemy. And Netzach fights with Amalek. He's not concerned with Amalek, he's concerned with Elam Hazi. You got to get Amalek out of the way, you have to fight with him. Hoid doesn't go out on an aggressive attack, but a Hoid acknowledges this as an opponent, and Hoid says, if I'm going to see this through, I'm going to have to be very, very stubborn, because Elam Hazi is going to stop me. Midas HaYesod is also an emotion. You must understand they were dealing with emotions. The meaning of the word emotion is feelings that are experienced on the outside. Passion, fire, bread. Yes? Midas HaYesod doesn't see an enemy. It only sees an endeavor, a purpose. I have to do something and I am going to do it. That's it. Anything that's in my way is going to get pushed aside, but I don't pay attention to enemies. I pay attention only to what I need to do. And this is called, in Chassidus is kashrus. Midas HaYesod is kashrus. A bond between a human being and an effort and an action. There's a world. I want to do something in the world. In order for me to do something in this world, I need to connect myself to whatever it is that I'm doing emotionally. So Midas HaYesod is not aggressive. Midas HaYesod is not stubborn. But Midas HaYesod is absolutely aggressive and absolutely stubborn. How could you yet be aggressive and not be aggressive? How could you yet be stubborn and not be stubborn? The Teretz says, you're aggressive but you don't see an enemy. You're stubborn but you don't see an enemy. In other words, you don't walk away with the impression that I did two things. I fought with an enemy and I achieved something in the world. There's no enemy, there's just a task. And the enemy has to be dealt with as a byproduct. And this is what I told you last week, that Yesod is Kaver Tzoy. It's the middle pole. Remember we talked about the middle pole like the mushal from the corner, which is a mushal brought from Sidus. I didn't make it up. Das, Tiferes, and Yesod are all the center. And they share this characteristic of being extraordinarily deep. I told you this last week. There's no emotion as Tiferes. There's an emotion of Chesed, which means inclusiveness and embracing and softness. There's an emotion of Gevura, which is discriminating and judging and precise and exact. I didn't say bad. Bad, the Hebrew word for bad is not Gevura. The Hebrew word for bad is Ra. And Gevura is not Ra. Gevura is Yitzchak. Yitzchak is also Gevura. It's Kedusha. It's the discriminating component of Kedusha, is Midas HaGevura. So it's an emotion. It's an emotion of inclusiveness and embracing, or an emotion of judgment and discernment, yeah? What's Tiferes? Tiferes is called Rachamim or Simcha, as I explained to you at length 2 weeks ago. Yeah? What's the emotion of Tiferes? The emotion of Tiferes is a little chesed, a little gevura. A little inclusiveness and a little discrimination. So there's no, in other words, Midas HaTiferes is an emes. It's not how I react to you. It's not how I judge you. It's how I feel what you feel. Ba'asher hu sham. I spoke about that at length 2 weeks ago. How I feel what you feel means me feeling you. Me feeling you is only possible on the level of the neshama. Why is it only possible on the level of the neshama? Because on the level of the neshama, the separation between 1 and 2 is broken down. There's a unity. On the guf level, everything is separate. On the neshama level, things are more unified. Midas Tiferes means me feeling you as you feel you. So there's the emotion of Midas Tiferes, and there's the truth of Midas Tiferes. The truth of Midas Tiferes is this breaking of the separation between one and the next, that you should feel somebody else. The emotion associated with Midas Tiferes, the feeling, is a little chesed and a little gvura, but the feeling is simply using the metzias, the guf, the form of chesed and gevura to say something which is really higher than a metzias. It's Midas HaTiferes. And the same is true of Midas HaYesod. And the same is true when it comes to Midas HaYesod. Midas HaYesod is the same thing. What's Midas HaYesod? It's a different kind of emotion. Why? Because it's not an emotion defined by how I experience me inside myself. Midas HaYesod, you need it back. Midas HaYesod means how I conquer the world. And that's a part of the job of a Yid, to conquer the world. Everybody has a little piece, right? It says in Tanya, Pedek Lamed Zayin, that we now finished in the Shurim in Tanya, Ritas, that every Yid has Chelke B'Elam, a shtickle Welt. The world is divided up into 613 parts. Every Yid has 1/600,000th of Elam Hazeh. And it's ours to elevate, and it's ours to keep clean, and the rest, like it says in Tanya, yeah. So how do you deal with your shtickle Welt? You have to conquer it. How do you conquer it? So Netzach and Hoid conquer the world by taking on an enemy, defeating the enemy, and changing the world. Midas HaYesod doesn't see an enemy, it sees only a mission. In other words, Midas HaYesod, like Midas Tiferes, is breaking a barrier between the person and his task. Just like on the level of the neshama, there's no separation between one Yid and another, on the level of the neshama, there's no separation between a Yid and his mission. And when a Yid has his mission. Yeah, the Rebbe gives a chosed, a shlichus, a responsibility, an obligation, and he sees it through. And of course, we're human beings, right? And we do it lefikei cheinu, with the best of our abilities, right? I heard once from a very reliable source that the Rebbe told a very big shliach, "Ich bin nicht der Maharal, ich kann nicht beschaffen kein Menschen. Ich arbeite mit was ich habe. I'm not the Maharal, I can't create people. I work with what God gave me, understand?" The Rebbe knew exactly who he's working with. You should know there's a tape, there's more than one tape, but the Rebbe said to the Balabatim once, that he said something to the effect that the Shluchim give him more than he could have ever expected. You know? The Rebbe said that by one of the Machane Yisrael occasions, and one of the times, by the way, Machane Yisrael was the beginning of Chedesh Nissen, this time of year. So the Rebbe said to the Balabatim, he was standing in the hall, there's a video of it, that to bring Mashiach, and with the Shluchim have done more. I forgot how he worded. The bottom line is that he said, he has gewaldige nachas. The Rebbe said, gewaldige nachas in the shluchim. You give a Yiddish shlich, you send it off to a place. Yeah, no. You encounters obstacles. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a book by Eliezer that's called The Secret of Chabad. If you don't mind politics, it's a very good read. And you see every place Lubavitch came, they had every kind of enemy. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. The story with Midian and Me'av. Midian and Me'av hated each other. Sinas Mavis. The Jews got involved, mit them all their buddies. Everybody was a friend when it came to fighting with Lubavitch. And today, 50, 60, 70 years on, they're on their hands and knees. It's remarkable. It's upsetting, Pashit. It's history. I mean, I remember as a child, as a teenager, to whatever extent you could say about a boy who lived in Crown Heights. I spent years in California, but we knew this. Anything that Rebbe tried to do it, megestalt fislach. Whatever you could do it, megestalt fislach. So you go on shlichus and you have to deal with those issues, no? So Midas Hayasai doesn't see an enemy. Doesn't see an enemy. He sees a mission. There are enemies in the way. Okay. Midas Hanetzach and Hay certainly see an enemy, yeah? And the reality of life is that it takes a very special kind of person not to see an enemy. You can't tell the average young man or a couple, Balabosa, Lubavitch Chassidim, yeah, went on Shlichus. How old are they? 25 years old, 26 years old. They come to a place, and wherever they look, the door slams shut, yeah? Oh, it's all love, it's all love, it's all love. It's a love Vestadim. It's Birudim. It's true. It's emes, yeah? But when you have to live that emes, Navaydim Apayel, Midas HaNetzach is one midah, and Midas HaChoyd is a second midah, and Midas HaYisay is a third midah. They're different midas. Yeah, Midas HaChoyd, Netzach sees an enemy. And he fights with him and he destroys him. He's very determined. Midas HaHoid doesn't fight with the enemy, but he doesn't let the enemy get to him. Midas HaYaseh doesn't see an enemy. He just sees the shlichus. Okay, so I repeated briefly what I told you last week, but I think I was a little bit more unequivocal, explicit in understanding what's unique about Midas HaYaseh. Midas HaNetzach has an enemy and he fights with him. Midas HaYehoid has an enemy, he doesn't let him defeat him. Midas HaYisod doesn't see an enemy, he sees only a purpose. Now I want to say another thing. Still talking about Midas Netzach Hayden Yisayid. We have in Chassidus an expression which is used often in a lot of different contexts. The expression is Kol HaGavaya B'Yoser Yered Lamata B'Yoser, or everything that has a higher source falls lower. Or vice versa, anything which has come lower is a sign that it has a higher source. There is a more mystical way to say this, there's a more abstract way to say this, and that is Kechesim HaMishapech. This is an expression which is found in Chassidus. Maybe it's from Kabbalah. This Lashon Kol HaGavaya B'Yeseh Yed Lamata Yeseh found all over Chassidus. And I think the Alter Rebbe invented that expression. I don't know that invented the expression in Kabbalah, but the other expression I would imagine is from before. Kechezim Mesapach means a very, very simple thing. If you have a signet ring, yeah, or a ring or a stamp of any sort, so what you have is ois yois boiltais, correct? You have a signet ring or a stamp, so you have a piece of rubber or a piece of metal or whatever it is that you're making it from, and the image or the letters that are supposed to make up the word that are supposed to establish what this is protrude. They stick out. They push out, right? You carve it out and you leave. It's called chok teches in halacha. you carve out the space around and you leave over the aces. You're not allowed to do that, right? When you write a letter in a Sefer Torah, you don't whiten out the space around the letter. You have to write the letter itself. But in aces achkika, that's how you do it. You take out the empty area and you leave over the aces. If you take this stamp and you press it into wax, so assuming that the stamp has a depth, a height, a millimeter, a half a millimeter, a millimeter and a half, it has a depth, yeah? So the part of the stamp which is furthest from the base will push the deepest into the wax. The part of the stamp which is closest to the base will push the least deep into the wax. In other words, it's inverse. That means it's upside down. It's equal and opposite. What's the furthest from the ring in the stamp is the deepest in the indentation in the wax. What's closest to the ring is the shallowest indentation in the wax. So whatever is closer to the ring doesn't go as far. Wherever is further from the ring goes further. It's the same idea, it's a different metaphor, you understand? And we say this about everything. And we also say it about Seder Ishtalshalos. In other words, you say that Chabad is higher than Chagas. But that means that Chagas has a higher Shadish. Because if it's fallen low, it has a higher Shadish. If you're familiar with the Kabbalah, this is the Maimah of the Rebbe's Chasana. The Rebbe said in Toshin Yudalid, Zo ba'atika ochet v'talye, right? Avo, Avo, V'zrei is the arich, I forget the whole Lashon. Chochma and Bina are garments for the arms of arich ampin, which is Chitzeni Yisakesir, and Zo ba'atika ochet v'talye. Ze'er anpin, the midas hang from atik, which is a higher madrege. So in other words, because it comes lower, the siman that is a higher shadish. And just like it's true of the midas in general, it's also true of the difference between the midas chesed, gevurah, teferes, and the midas netzach haydin yisayid. That because netzach haydin yisayid, the lower midas, they have a higher shadish. That's how it works. Okay. Now a little. What's the word I'm looking for? Biology for the morning or neurology for the day, and I know much about neurology. As you know about Kabbalah and Zicher Weinig, I don't know anything about it, but I'm curious about these things, and I ask people. They know so little about the brain. It's remarkable how little they know about the brain, but they still know an awful lot, and they're always finding out surprises. It's really a frontier. To understand the brain is an extraordinary thing, because the brain is a small little body with so much detail, and what they're discovering as they study is that oftentimes they have regions, right? Regions of the brain that have to do with seeing, regions of the brain that have to do with hearing. And they're finding out that very disparate parts of the brain are connected. It's very, very complicated. It's very, very, very complicated, yeah. But there's something called the prefrontal lobe. The prefrontal lobe is called biologically the new part of the brain. Animals, I don't even think monkeys, have prefrontal lobe. It's considered the new part, and it's the front, over here. Yeah? Which is where you have,
personality.
It's not just personality, it's analysis and critical thinking and abstract reasoning. It's a human being has a part of the brain that an animal, lahavlo, simply does not possess. And they use evolutionary terms, which are terms that we don't use. It's the newest part of the brain. In other words, the way they see the development of the brain, they see it developing over time. We see it developing over a level of creation. They were all created in the same 6 days. So it's simply a technical detail. Did it happen slowly or did it happen quickly? But that's how they articulate it. The language that they use, it's today for words. They see it happening over time. Yeah, but there's the new part of the brain, there's the old part of the brain, and the oldest part of the brain. And you see today, of those animals that are very primitive, simple animals, very, very simple animals, like crustaceans, like mollusks, like animals that don't, that are not, what are the words? Chordata and vertebrata. They don't have a cord, they don't have a vertebrate. Simple animals, yeah? Their entire reality is instinct. Everything that happens in their world, they have an instant to respond, right? And the expression that they use in psychology is fight or flee. You encounter an enemy and you have a split second. Am I going to stand and fight? In other words, do I stand the chance of surviving by fighting? Or am I going to run away? And if I run away, I better run right away, because if I hesitate, I'm not going to get very far. You understand? It's the most basic part of the brain. It's completely instinct. Yeah? And then there are higher parts of the brain, more sophisticated parts of the brain, which allow for higher emotions, right? An insect, an ant, doesn't become sad. You understand? When one of his babies is eaten by a bird, he has no such concept. There are animals that can feel. They can feel love, they can feel pain, they can feel hatred, they can feel jealousy, they can feel vengeance. These are higher emotions. So there's different levels of the brain which correspond to different grades of sophistication in a person. So the most sophisticated part of the person is the Chabad. The less sophisticated part of the person is the Chagas. Why Chagas? Chagas is higher emotions. Chagas doesn't only mean how am I going to survive. Chagas means how does this feel to me? How does this feel to me? And the whole point of Chagas is not what I'm going to do or what happened, but how do I feel about it? It's a very human kind of an emotion. I'm sorry for doing this, I really shouldn't. Do you know that when elephants encounter the bones of their deceased family members, and they can be dead for years, and they're bleached white, there's no life, they can smell the members of their herd. You understand? An elephant, they walk hundreds of miles, and they'll come across bones of a deceased relative, and they'll literally mourn. They'll pick up the bones, and you'll see they have, on the sides of their faces, they have these ducts, I forgot what they're called, that literally leak, like crying. And you could see visually, emotionally responding. An animal died 10 years ago. They come across the bones. It's incredible. Abal Chai. You know, the halacha is when you see an elephant, you're supposed to say Meshana Briyas. And everybody assumed that they're saying Meshana Briyas because of the trunk. I don't think you're saying Meshana Briyas because of the trunk. I think you're saying Meshana Briyas because the elephants are incredible creatures. They have fantastic memories, unbelievable memories. They're unbelievable animals. You know, the smartest animals are elephants and dolphins. But they can feel pain, and they can feel happiness, and they can feel sadness, and they can hold on to memory. Why would an elephant remember the bones of a deceased? 20 years ago, someone died. Shalain vergessen. They'll push it, come across the bones coincidentally. They're walking from one place to another, they'll come across the bones, and they'll ibeleb nachama. It's an incredible thing. It's an amazing thing. The point is, there are animals that have the capacity to feel very, very sophisticated, higher emotions. There's no animal in the world that can understand abstract reasoning. You know, why I was made and what's my purpose of existence. But they have chagas. They have chesed, gevurah, teferes. They can experience ahava. They can certainly experience hate, kas, yira, sinna, kinna. These are higher emotions. Yeah. And so on and so forth. But every creature that's alive has to have a nihi. Because nihi basically is your instinct. If you don't have any instincts, you're the next animal's lunch that you come across. We all live as independent beings, right? You exist because you're separate from your environment. And between you and your environment there's a wall. And you preserve yourself. How do you preserve yourself? By reacting to what's going on in your environment. Sometimes you react proactively when you're looking for food and so on. And sometimes you react reactively when you're responding to what's going on in your environment. So the way it works is the Chabad is the highest level of the brain, the Chagas is the second level of the brain, and the Nihi is a lower level of the brain. But there's two sides to this. The obvious side is that Chabad is much more sophisticated than Chagas. And Chagas is much more sophisticated than Nihi. Only certain animals have a developed Chagas, other animals have much more basic emotions. You're not going to say about a cat that they can experience chagas, love and compassion like an elephant can. They also have, they're mammals, right? They have a certain level. It's not nearly as sophisticated as is in other animals. Yeah, but you have to have a nihi. So nihi is the lowest level. But there's another side to the coin. What's the other side to the coin? The other side to the coin is that the more sophisticated a neurological response, more sophisticated an involvement in an inyan, whether it's seichel or it's midas, the weaker it is. And the more basic, the more visceral, the more atzmiistic, the more seminal an emotion is, the stronger it is. And the simple mashal for this, and this mashal is used in Chassidus, is fingers and a fist. Fingers and a fist. The Eibishter made us with fingers. A finger is not that strong. Yeah, you bang your finger into the wall, you can hurt it. Yeah. you take the fingers and you close them, and you make them into a fist, so they can't hold a pencil, and they can't turn a key in a lock, they can't unscrew a screw, but they have a force. You have if you look at most animals, the Eibusha took their fingers and fused them. They also have fingers, but they were joined together into a hoof, or into a paw, or into a foot, that they don't have the ability, they're not dexterous, they can't use their fingers to open up, find things, they don't have that capacity. If they want to separate one from another, they use their mouth, because their fingers have been fused to be strong. Lahavla, human being, has very, very fine motor skills, right? That's the word that we use, right? In early intervention, yeah? Fine motor skills, so to be able to use your fingers in a very sophisticated way. So you have this in Chassidus, yeah? In Torah, you have 5 fingers. Every finger is a different inyan. There's halachas associated with each finger. There's inyanim associated with each finger. Every one of the fingers is negated to something else, yeah? The pinky is negated to a kmitza, the middle finger is negated to a amo or a zeres, the thumb is negated. Every finger has a different inyan in Torah, and it serves a different purpose in the way the Eibishter made human beings. Every finger is very, very, very important. Very, very important. Yeah? But they're not strong. When you clench your fist, you close your fingers, and make them into a fist, it has much more power, but has much less sophistication. And the nimshal is at the higher levels of the nefesh, Chabad, Chagas, are more superficial than the nefesh. They're more sophisticated, but it's a trade-off, you understand? They're more complex, they're more nuanced, they're more sophisticated, but they're less powerful. They're less, what you call in Chassidus, atzmiistic. Okay, and I'll explain it to you briefly. In Chassidus it's brought that the nefesh is believable. In Chassidus it's also brought that the believable of the nefesh cannot function in a finite world. We talked about this at length earlier in this sequence. In this same Peidik Gimel, we're in Peidik Gimel, this is, I think, class 13. We're soon going to have a Peidik for every line in this Peidik, a Shir. Yeah? So we talked about this earlier. The infinite nefesh cannot function in the real world. Why not? Because the world is finite. You have finite amount of space, and sitting next to you is another person. And because sitting next to another person, you have to be mitzamtzem your expansion to allow for another person to exist. So the infinity of the nefesh can't exist by itself in the real world. There could only be one human being per universe if the infinity of the neshama would be. So the neshama is decorated with complex, finite tools. Koiches hanefesh. The tools are limited. They're limited. They're basically limited. They're b'medida of agbol. And the finite tools allow you to interact with another person. The dugma hapshuta b'yesed is, you want to do something. Yeah? So you come to another human being. You say to the other human being, I want to do this. So the other human being says to you, why? Now the real answer to the question is, because I want. But if when someone asks you why you want to do something, your answer is because you want, you're a meshuggah. There has to be a reason. What's the difference between because I want and a reason? If it's because I want, you can't negotiate with me. There's nothing to discuss. You can't say I'll give you half. You can't say I'll give you 3/4. You can't say you could try something different. But if I want for a reason, what if I can come up with a reason and a way to get to the same end that's even better than you planned, but it's different? So they say, oh, Yitak, I don't need this because I really am interested in that. And since you're coming up with another way, so that's the difference between the infinity of the neshama and the finitude, the gvul of what's called the koyichis hanefesh. The infinity of the neshama is infinite power, but it's simple. You can't negotiate the infinite neshama. It's not only simple because he's stupid, not only simple because he's simplistic, simple because he's ain't safe. So there's Hebrew words that denote these two ideas. What I just said is called in Chassidus Gilui HaNefesh and Koyach HaNefesh. Gilui HaNefesh means the whole neshama speaks. Koyach HaNefesh means the neshama speaks through a tool. And when the neshama speaks through a tool, it conforms to the limitations of how that tool can speak. When you use your seichel, your mind, your intelligence, to say what's going on inside of you, you have to explain everything. And you can't explain everything. So you're mavated. You say the aspects of what I'm feeling that I cannot explain, I'm going to put aside. And I'm going to come to you and give you a reasonable explanation why I want this and why I want it in this way and in this place and in this time and so on. And then we can talk I have my reason why I should do it like this. You have your reason why it should be done a little bit differently. And we find an Eimek Hashava, we find common ground, we find a way to make it work. That my reason and your reason allow there should be enough room in the Eibishter's great world for me and for you together. On the level of a Ratzon that's impossible. So the Gilei HaNefesh says the whole Neshama. The Koiches HaNefesh say the Neshama in a measure and a containment. You follow? This is the basic idea. But there's different kinds of koiches. Chochmah is a koyach, Bina is a koyach, Chesed is a koyach, and Gvura is a koyach, and Netzach is a koyach, and Hoyd is a koyach, and Yossi is a koyach. They're all tools. Even Midas HaNetzach is not the infinite neshama. The infinite neshama is called the Ratzon. Will. Will means I want. You can't argue with want. You can't argue with want. I want. Will. Midas HaNetzach means you're my enemy and you're standing in my way and I have to get this done, and if I have to use whatever I have at my disposal I will. I'm going to get past you and get what I need to get done. So Netzach is a midah. It's a measure. What's the measure? It fights with an enemy who stands in his way. If you're not his enemy and you're not standing in his way, you don't bother him. So it's a midah. But it's closer to the etzem. In other words, it's closer to the etzem. Even though all of the tools are by definition taking the neshama's infinity, taking Neshama's bli gevul, and packaging it in a tziyur, in a koyach, in a gevul, so it should be able to exist in the real world. Chabad is the most sophisticated taka, it's the most intricate, it's the most involved, it's the most nuanced, but it also represents the infinity of the neshama the least. The toikef of the neshama is hidden in Chabad. Like it says in Chassidus, when you're trying to think and reason, you can't be nervous, you can't be excited, you can't be intense, you have to be relaxed. Faket, if the neshama is in overdrive, if there's too much neshama shturming in your consciousness, you can't think. But the lower levels of the koiches faket, midas hanetzach, we all know this from Basi Lagani. Remember, v'gam netzach Yisrael le'yinochem v'le'yishoker kilei yodem hu le'yinochem. What's the pshat? The pshat is that the Eibishter tells the Navi Shmuel to make a melech whose name is Shaul. As they shit in Chumash, in Tanakh, in Sefer Shmuel. Shaul was Nebuch. Shaul is a tragic life. Shaul was a godl shabbat. He was bechlal not interested in melucha. He was a humble, quiet nechbel hakelim. He was a giant. He was a mishichme v'mayla gaveya mikol am. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. But Shaul was not looking for notoriety. He was looking for fame. He was looking for power. It found him. You know why it found him? Because he was the most worthy. That's the answer. Of all the Jews on the planet at that particular time, it made the most sense that Shaul should have made a melech. So the Eibishter says, we're picking a king. Who are we going to pick? The person most qualified. Now, I'm going to whisper a secret in your ear. But I'm going to say it loud enough that everybody should be able to hear. Yeah. What's the secret? The secret is that the Melucha always belonged to Yehuda. It says in Chumash in Pashas Vayechi, LeYosser shevet mi Yehuda, u'mecheking bein raglav ad ki yavish Shilei. From the beginning till Mashiach, Shilei is the Gematria Mashiach, as you know, is Yavish Shilei is Gematria Mashiach, is Yehuda. So the Eibishter picks a king from Shevet Binyamin. Now, if you're from Shevet Yehuda, you should get nervous, justifiably so. I thought the Melucha belongs to Yehuda. Yehuda Gur Aryeh, and a lion is the Melech of all the Chayas. So why are you giving it to Shevet Binyamin? What's the teretz? The teretz is that the progenitor, the father of the family of Melucha is not born yet, or he's not of age yet. He's not ready. So Shaul was made a king on what grounds? Availability. And that's why Shmuel gets so upset, right? Why does Shmuel get so upset that he didn't ask for a king? And the Eibishter says to Shmuel HaNavi, it's not you they don't like, it's me they don't like. It's a mitzvah sasei de'eraisa, same tosem alech hamelech. That's a pasuk in Chumash. Yidden are supposed to make a king, so they come to make a king, and Shmuel gets upset. And the answer is they're supposed to make a king, but that king is supposed to come from the Eibishter. And if that king comes from the Eibishter, he's going to be from Shevet Yehuda, which is called Mashiach. That is Nimshach Bekeren. And there that the Mashiach's not cooked yet, and noch nicht great. Mashiach is not yet cooked, and the Jews want a king. So Shmuel understands that their interest in a king is not for religious reasons, it's for political reasons, it's for social reasons, it's for normalcy reasons. And he doesn't like it. And the Eibishter goes along with it because it says in the Torah, so they choose a king because he was the most worthy. Yeah? And then a little while later, the fellow who Keser Hel Mosei, to whom the kingship truly belongs, shows up on the scene as if a shepherd. And he plays the harp. He's a romantic, you understand. Make a shepherd who plays the harp, a warrior. That's what David HaMelech was. David HaMelech was 30 years old when he was anointed. He wasn't a little boy. When he fought with Goliath, he wasn't 11. He was in his 20s. He was a big man. But he was such a softy. He had no toughness. He was a shepherd. He never killed anything in his life. His brothers were soldiers in the army of Shaul HaMelech. And David was a nebuch. He was an adult. He was a man. He wasn't a boy. But he was such a sweetheart, and he became David Melech Yisrael. So when there is this shift from Shaul to David, and Shmuel is brokenhearted, so the Navi says, this is Netzach Yisrael. Netzach, Midas HaNetzach. And Netzach Yisrael is Le'inochem, Le'yishaker, Kilei Adam Hu Le'inochem. We chose Shaul HaMelech because there was a time and a place and a need and an availability. So the whole choice in Shaul HaMelech was a reasonable choice. It was a choice made in Lashon Chassidus on the Madreg of Adam. When you're talking about Seder Ishtalshos, where everything is V'edida V'Agbala, you didn't need a king. And the one who was destined to be the king is not ready. So you choose what's available. There's halachas. He has to be from Zeri Yisrael. He has to be a Ben Zochar. He's not allowed to be an Eved. He has to be a Frumerid. He has to listen to the Navi. That's all qualifications to be a Melech. But the whole kingship was reasonable. The choice of Shaul, as great a man as he was a choice based on circumstance. And then along comes David HaMelech. It's a whole new set of rules. A whole new set of rules. Why? It's not coming from the same place. It's not the pshat that Shaul messed up. Okay, he's no good, we'll try him. That happened. That's what happened. But that's not the real story. That's the symptoms. The real story is this decision came from Chochmah Bina Vadas, from Adam, and this decision came from Netzach Yisrael. Le'inochem, le'ishoket, kilei Adam. So what's the word? Netzach is a midah. Netzach is an emotion. Which means Netzach is a koyach. It's a tool. Netzach is not the whole neshama. Why is Netzach not the whole neshama? Because the whole neshama is not a midah, the whole neshama is not a koyach, the whole neshama is not a svira, the whole neshama is called a gilui, or it's called a ratz. But you see, Netzach, hey, then you say the lowest three midas, because they are so low, are much closer to the nefesh. Based on the principle of Kechesam HaMishapech, whatever is higher falls lower, so midas and Netzach is not sophisticated. Midas doesn't make analysis. Midas doesn't make peace treaties. Midas Netzach fights wars. Mitzvah Chesed makes peace treaties. Midas Netzach fights to win. Like you learned the Maimah from Yossi Nagani. What does the Rebbe say? There's something called the Melchemes Nitzachim. Melchemes Nitzachim means simple. This war we can't lose. Now how are we going to win? And the answer is whatever it takes. There's nothing outside of whatever. Why not? Because you can't lose. The emotion that a person employs, and of course the way Chassidus explains it, that a king has this emotion more than anybody else. The Rebbe Rashab spoke about it when he get to World War I and the king Yemelt, the German king and the Russian king, that a melech has a toikif that no other human being has. Because the Rebbe said that a Gashmizik, a king, a goy, is margish his mazel. And it gives him a koyach that makes him mad in terms of his determination to win. He'll throw hundreds of thousands of men into an inferno because he has a midas hanetzach. The Rebbe Rashab is in Teir Shalom gedruckt, even by a goy. That's unbelievable, more than an ordinary person. And midas hanetzach has a very low level in terms of kechas hanefesh, but it carries a very deep power from the atzmus hanefesh. In other words, when you do something by instinct, by spontaneous response, which you have no time to react, and no time to analyze, and no time to weigh, and no time to judge. You can make a mistake. When you make a mistake, it's a terrible mistake. But there is a force in that decision which is as close to the Yetzam HaNefesh as I could be without being called Yetzam HaNefesh itself. And that's the upside of Nehi. Netzach, you say, the Rebbe says in Teir Shalom, but I've logged Nehi, the Rebbe Marash was logging Nehi, Nehi. The whole story, not for now. The midas of Nehi are the most superficial midas. They're not emotions that define you. They're emotions that define your involvement in the world. But there's something about these lowly emotions which gets them in touch with the deepest levels of the neshama, that when you encounter obstacles, midas hachesed tries to make peace treaty, let's make nice, let's figure this out. Midas hanetzach is like a running through a wall. And of course, the Rebbe says in Basi Lagani, that now, the day Rashvi is the Melchamas Nitzachin, and the Melchamas Nitzachin is very simple. You have to bring Mashiach Tzidkenu. So there's a bizbuz ha'etzis, right? There's a midas hanetzach. The king has to win a war. And this goes back yet to the Friedrich Rebbe. Yeah, we're talking about Beis Nissen. Today's Beis Nissen. Beis Nissen is not only the Stalkos of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe spoke about Tashmam Chestaka 30 years ago today. The Rebbe spoke that Beis Nissen is the beginning of the Nesias of the Friedrich Rebbe. 30 years ago, the Rebbe said it was 68 years. Chayim Shona. Now it's 98 years. Tzadik Ches Shona. I don't know if you know the Rebbe is at Tzadik Ches. Tzadik Ches is twice Memtes. It says in Sfarim that in Pashas B'chukesai there are 49 klolos. And in Pashas Kisovei there's 98 klolos. Which means one less than 50 or one less than 100. So now we're already in the 99th year. You understand? The 98 years finishes yesterday. And like the Gemara says about another thing, Tochel Shona v'kilelei seha v'tochel Shona u'birchesa. You finish with 98, so close up to Kashayches nicht. That's a remez. It's a remez. I'm not a rebbe. It's a remez. It's brought to Chassidus. I mean, I don't have anything original. I don't have any. Alphas is like a big head that they get late. Hopefully, I repeat it the way I read it and learned it. You finish with 98, no shachas the klala anymore. Now it's only bracha. But in any case, so the Friedrich becomes a rebbe. We all know the story. And amongst the things that the Friedrich Rebbe said was that Tarmi Shalile Nadarti. Yeah, a Chabad Rebbe comes into the world for what? For Chochma Bina Das. Chochma Bina Das is not a warrior. Chochma Bina Das is not fighting with the world. Chochma Bina Das is taking the best Jews and making them better. That's what Chochma Bina Das is. It's the deepest Chassidus, the highest kind of Avodas Hashem, the deepest kind of Avodas Hashem. But there's a connection between Emek Reim and Emek Tachas, which means that there's a connection between the highest level and the lower level. And the Friedrich Rebbe writes, you have to read his letters, that the role of preserving Yiddishkeit and keeping Chinuch al Taras HaKedesh and keeping the shuls open and the mikvahs Taras open and the Beit HaMedrash open, but the Kessel open, it was all in Teiro and Davos and Yidden is for the Rabbonim. It's not my job. My job is to teach Chassidus Chabad and to inspire the best of the best to serve the Eivishter on the highest level possible. But Allah is not laughing from the Maracha, the Friedrich Rebbe writes. Everybody has jumped ship. The Rabbonim have run from Russia. And you couldn't blame them, but that was the fact. I have a Mogehet, and I forgot my source, and I'd like to see it in print, that the Chafetz Chaim was not only older than the Friedrich Rebbe, the Chafetz Chaim was older than the Rebbe Rashab by many years. Chafetz Chaim left Russia. And when he saw what the Friedrich Rebbe did, he said, we were wrong and he was right. We thought that there's no way you can fight. Chafetz Chaim was a real Jew. Chafetz Chaim would give his life without a hesitation. There's no question. Chafetz Chaim was an emissary. Chafetz Chaim left Russia because they didn't see any future. And the Rebbe stayed and he fought. And the reality is, the whole time that the Soviet regime stood, there was like a cheles hayahadus, because of the nefesh of the Rabbeim and their Chassidim. Yeah? So the Friedrich Rebbe is no longer busy with Chabad, he's busy with Nehi. And when it comes to Nehi, there's a Netzach Yisrael, Le'yinochem, V'le'yishokek Eliyodem, L'sishka Mensch. It's an infamous Yiddish nefesh. No chesh b'yidus. I heard a tape from a Sikh of the Rebbe. And it's a famous Sikh, but I heard the tape also. The Rebbe tells a story that the Friedrich Rebbe was getting letters. This is yet in Russia. And amongst the letters that he received a letter from a chassid, was a gishtanin in a hecha madrege, a big chassid. I don't know how old he was, but the Rebbe says, Betan Emes, as gishtanin in a madrege nailis, standing in a very high level of avodah and teira and Yerushalayim and chassidus. And he also received a letter from a young manchik, a Tomim, with all due respect. He was a young man who was writing to the Friedrich Rebbe about matters of Askonos. So the Friedrich Rebbe immediately answers this young man And the Alter Chassid waited weeks for his answer, till the Rebbe had time. The Alter Chassid, they lived in the same city. And the Alter Chassid got word, found out, why should he keep it a secret? The Mr. They spoke, that his answers came immediately. So he wrote the Friedrich Rebbe a letter. And the Rebbe repeats this whole story by Fabrengen from the beginning to the end. And he writes to the Friedrich Rebbe that he doesn't understand. That a young man writes a letter and he gets an answer right away. And an Elter Chassid, I'm sure he didn't say, and I'm so and so and so, but from this he was taka so and so. And the Rebbe doesn't say that he was genart, that he was delusional. The Rebbe said that he was taka big bal madrei. And the Rebbe's answers to me hesitate, they take time. So the Friedrich Rebbe wrote him that now is a different time. He said, it's true. Of course I should answer you first. But now, Asiya Liela, by Hamed Rishikir Allah Hamaise, whoever is involved on the front lines of action, this is what matters. It's much lower, but it's closer to the essence. That's Netzach, Hayden, you say. They're very simple. You have to win a war. And the alternative, what did she say in the 19th century? What was her name? Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria. Failure is not an option. Failure is not an option. Failure is not an option. Finished. The only thing that's forever is a Jew and Judaism. Even the British Empire is failure is not an option. Failure is not an option means you have to win at all costs. The midas that are employed in fighting such a war are not chacham bina v'das. They're not even chesed gevur tefesach. The netzach heid you say. So in the Maimer of Basri Lagani, he speaks about midas hanetzach, and he brings the points. Everybody knows the points. Number one is called bizbuz ha'eitzris. He takes the treasure, which has been held leishosvei ayin by his parents, by his grandparents, and he not only gives them away, but he gives them away in a reckless way. And for whom does he give them away? For whom? The material is given to the generals. But they're not given for the generals for the sake of the generals. They're given to the generals for the foot soldier, for the ish, chayil, pashat. That's how the Rebbe explains it. Who's on the front line, who's the only thing between Nitzach and Hepech and Nitzach in a case where you cannot lose. Right? Bizbuz eitzes. Was geht weiter? What's the next thing it says in the Maimer? Machnis es atzmei betachsisei ha-molchama. I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the last?
Machnis es atzmoi betachsisei ha-molchama. Kings don't fight wars. Generals fight wars. Kings govern. Kings see how to keep track of all the things in the country. But when you're fighting a Mulcham, which was Mulchamas Nitzachin, the king doesn't rely on anybody. He personally engages and he puts himself into it. All the decisions are made. You should know that in Teda Shalom, I've mentioned this to you before. It's taka interesting and odd. When World War I started, the Rebbe Rashab understood very well what the score was. He knew that Russia was, or what they call in the culture, a dinosaur. It was gigantic, but it was a cadaver. It was basically dead. Russia was hollow. They had a lot of soldiers, and they were willing to die for their king. They just didn't have any guns. Otherwise, they were terrific. When the Russian soldiers look at World War II, they're incredibly tough, but they were so unprepared. And they had it was a monarchy. Yeah, so it was all politics. Who was a general? A Romanov. What qualifies you to be a general? Because you're a Romanov? Because there's a bottle of whiskey named after you, or a vodka? It's not a fight. There was one member of the Romanov family. He was an ashtikal general. All the rest are a bunch of drunken losers. And the Rebbe Rashab indicated. I saw a word where the Rebbe Zayda, our Rebbe Zayda, the Baruch Shneur, asked the Rebbe Rashab, what's going to be with World War I? So first the Rebbe Rashab shrugged his shoulders. I don't know. And then he said with a bittel, Ein Volk soll sich entgegenstellen der ganze Welt. One nation should take on the whole world. The Rebbe Rashab knew that it was just Germany. Even though there was officially an alliance, there was an axis with the Habsburgs and with the Ottoman Turks. One of the German generals said at one point during the war about their collaboration with the what are they called? The Austria-Hungary I feel like I'm tethered to a corpse. They would have been better off without him. It was Germany fighting with the ganze Welt. That's what the fact was. So the Rebbe made a comment, one nation, what about Gaive? How much of a Gaive do you have to be? They can fight, and that's exactly what it was. Germany took on the whole world. More in World War I even than in World War II. But the word that I want to share was that the Rebbe Rashab said that he's very worried about Russia. And the only hope, as the case says, that the Tsar should himself get involved in the war. His name was Nicholas, and he was an inbred idiot. He was a fool. He was a stupid fool. And a king who's a fool is worse than a king who's an achsen. The first Nikolai was a Russia. The first Nikolai was a Russia. But the first Nikolai was a Chocha B'chuk. The second Nikolai was also a Russia, but he was a Tipish Betipshim. And the Rebbe Rashab wanted he should get involved in the war. But he didn't say he wants to get involved. No, it's such a big Chocham. He wants to get involved in the war. He said, because if he'll get involved in the war, the Malach of Medina's Rusland will be on the front lines, and that creates a greater possibility for victory. And what happened was, he got involved in the war, and it was a fiasco. It was a disaster. But the Rebbe Rashab was speaking in other words, how wars are really won and lost, not on the battlefield, but they were going on Lamaila. And the Rebbe said, the only hope for Russia is that the Keser Alain will put himself into the war, and he did, and it wasn't enough. The Rebbe Rashab didn't miscalculate. The Rebbe Rashab knew what he saw. That if Russia has a hope of winning the war, it's going to be only if the Tsar himself gets involved, and it turned out it wasn't enough. So the Maimeh Bossi Legani says that when you have Midas HaNetzach, the king is Machnes Aser with Achsisei Muchova. He doesn't trust anybody. He does it himself. And this is what we saw by the Rabbeim. Our Rabbeim, the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe, they were busy with Tinekish or Besrabon, with little children, and with Batei Chabad, and with Shmiras Shabbos, and Achilas Kosher. The simplest things, which every Yiddish Mama could look after. Certainly every Rov, and a Rebbeson, and a Kehila, it becomes the personal concern of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I told you this a number of times already, because it's so moving to me. Uri Kaplun wrote a book about his grandfather, the Meshach Zalman Feiglin, who lived in Australia. And he writes in the book a Sikha from the Rebbe that's telling a story about the Friedrich Rebbe, that the Rebbe the Shved sich nicht gekannt legen. The Friedrich Rebbe would not go to sleep at night until he knew that one copy of the Talks and Tales was put in the mail for a single Jewish child in Australia. So there's a Sikha from the Rebbe where the Rebbe says this, that the Friedrich Rebbe would not go to sleep at night until he knew that the Talks and Tales for children's reading in English were put in the mail that one kid in Australia should read. And then he finishes the sentence with a few more words. That child is me. And it's a whole different story. It's a different story. You think, Mida trachten wegen an ein einziger Kind. The Lubavitcher Rabbeim, the Friedrich Rebbe, and the Rebbe, you can't say they were Mavater and Chabad. The Friedrich Rebbe gesagt, Bishmanenu al Yerozen. There was Chabad also. But they were involved in things that are b'chlal not the business of a Rebbe. Certainly not a Chabad Rebbe. Why? Because it's Midas HaNetzach. Okay, ich hab's gefaret, yeah? You get the point. What did we do today? I reviewed again Midas HaNetzach Hedin Yesed, and I brought out this point, that the lowest level, the lowest Midas of the Nefesh, have the deepest Sherish and Atmas HaNefesh. Which is why from Midas HaNetzach and Midas HaHoid, you have a Gila Yechida. The takeoff of these midas is stronger than Chagas and stronger than Chabad. Okay, Mitzvah tomorrow was time to learn the Pedic. I highly doubt that next Sunday we're going to learn Tanya. We'll see. Maybe we'll learn Tanya. Tzazei. Next thing we have to talk about is I want to talk about Midas HaMalchus a little bit. I also want to talk about the Heichushim. We'll eventually actually get back to learning Tanya from the text. Okay, if you'll stick around for a few minutes, we'll do a little bit of Hayem Yem today also.